One. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Park Score podcast. I'm back again with Mr. George Boreas, and in today's episode, we're going to be talking about mimetic theory, Girard's mimetic theory, and the Gospel of John. And so, just a quick heads up for you guys: this is going to be kind of a more advanced Girard episode than the common ones that we've done in the past. This is not going to be like an intro to Girard or anything like that. We are going to assume some kind of basic level of familiarity with René Girard and his mimetic theory. But we're going to be going through the Gospel of John, kind of walking through it and seeing some of the mimetic themes within and some of the themes of scapegoating and other things that have to do with René Girard's mimetic theory. But George, how you been? What are your, I guess, initial thoughts on this topic here?
I've been good, thank you. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I've refreshed a little bit on my Girard scapegoat book and such, and I hope I'll have the memory to dig out some Girard connects. Yeah, let's do it.
Sweet. So, first of all, I mean, starting with the very beginning, just verse 1 of chapter 1 of John, I want to go ahead and say the reason that I decided on choosing this gospel in particular was because I had some discussions with my priest, and I asked him, I said, what gospel or which book of the Bible do you think is most worth committing to memory and memorizing? And he essentially said John. John is a very cornerstone piece of the Bible. It's it's one of the most, you could say, divine books of the entire Bible. And obviously, with regard to René Girard's scapegoat theory, a big thing about it is that Christ is essentially the religious figure who comes in human history to expose once and for all the scapegoat mechanism. And part and parcel of that is mimetic desire, causing people to reach levels of tension in society that result in people all converging on one object of desire and eventually getting to the point where they're willing to murder each other to acquire that. And so there's a lot of themes of status, imitation, worship. There's a lot of themes of, I think, deification here as well. And so, yeah, just starting off with chapter 1, verse 1, everyone has heard it. It's a very famous verse. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. I wrote here essentially that understanding Christ as someone who is more than just a mere human is essential to not only understand Christianity, but also, I think, Girard's mimetic theory. I don't know if you have maybe any thoughts on that, George.
Yeah. As it happens, I've been getting into some metaphysical readings and spats also on X. But my thing has been to, I've been trying, my latest project is to try to connect Girard with classical metaphysics. In John, we see a reference to metaphysics. In the beginning was the Word. So the word used is logos, right? The Greek word meaning Greek word meaning word, but also having a very deep metaphysical meaning to the philosophers of the era, Christian and non-Christian philosophers. So logos is in that time to the philosophers, logos meant the ordering principle of the universe. Where I am connecting with Girard is I'm connecting with the Girard's idea of image. So in classical metaphysics, logos is the pattern of the universe. It's also the illegible pattern of everything created. But another word used in philosophy a lot is the image. So there's this idea, even in Aristotle, Plato, and those guys, that there are ideal images of everything, right, somewhere up in heavens. But later on in mid-Platonism, there's this idea that the mind of God produces these ideal images, or logoi, these words, these patterns that are then created, that are imbued onto the universe. So that gets tied in by St. John the Evangelist into the Christian framework, and then Christian philosophy takes that on in a whole new directions for the next whole bunch of centuries, until today, really. But the point here is that Christ is identified with the logos, so the God, the Word that creates the whole universe. But in another way, when logos becomes man, according to Christian patristic interpretation, Christ embodies the image of the ideal man into the flesh, so that we who are lost, humanity which has lost the image of the proper man, can countenance it, see it again, obviously not just see it, but hear it and learn from it, or him, so that we can be restored to that original pattern. So I think, curiously, where this comes together with Girard is Girard's all about imitation, right? Imago, image, and icon, right? So all these words are connected. So in Girard, right, we are imitative creatures. Philosophically, that can be understood as that we, by our nature, we are looking for that pattern, right? We need to find the right pattern that leads to life, that restores us to our full being. If we turn away from that pattern, we will seek it elsewhere, right? And that's where idolatry and all that stuff comes in. And I think that's really the big connect here with Girard, because Girard's mimetic theory, in so much in a slightly other language, says that you have to imitate someone. If you don't imitate God, you're going to imitate your false idols, and those are going to lead you astray. They go down the path of sadomasochism and so on. So I'm liking that pattern now. I think that's the way to integrate René Girard's theory, which seems kind of totally like unphilosophical. It seems like it comes from a whole different angle, but I think it confirms this theological thing, and St. John the Evangelist, known as the theologian, is recognized as being that bridge between metaphysics and the scriptures, right?
Right. And again, kind of piggybacking off of that. So the main idea here, guys, is that the reason why it's important that Christ is a divine person and not just another human person, another great moral teacher or something like that we can imitate. The idea is that if Christ is him through which all things were made, then that is you can think of there's no more perfect being or way of being that a person could imitate, because in mimetic theory the idea is that you're always going to be imitating somebody. Girard said that all desire is a desire for being. I like to think a lot of times that we desire we sort of model the desire of our idols. If I see a certain basketball player or something and I idolize him, I want to live like he does, insofar as I think that's possible. But the problem with setting up human persons as idols, or people who are just created beings that are themselves imperfect, and their being itself is derivative. If you're imitating a derivative being, then you're kind of just like a copy of a copy. And a lot of times what happens, if you've ever taken a copy of just like a piece of paper and you've copied it over and over and over and over and over, what you find are certain artifacts will build on that image, certain artifacts that were not in the original image. And you can kind of think of this a lot of times as corruptions, things that shouldn't be there, certain passions, certain desires, they're being replicated over time, and this leads to the proliferation of desire, that leads to the mimetic crisis that eventually puts us in a position where everyone is maximally sort of frustrated in their desires and their their pursuit of their objects, and this leads to situations where the crowd sort of converges on one person as a scapegoat. And this kind of moves us up into the next verse. I think the verse that stood out to me as most emblematic of this was verse 11 of chapter 1, where it says, "He came unto his own, and his own received him not." And then continuing on to verse 12, it says, "But as many as received him, to them he gave the power to become the sons of God, even to them that believe on his name." And the idea here is that to receive him is, in a certain sense, to imitate him, right? It's to see that he is this person worth imitating, worth following, worth devoting yourself entirely to. It's realizing that he's the perfect being that we must imitate in order to not only be healed, but to fulfill and ultimately transcend our, created state, our human nature. And then kind of moving on in chapter 1, verse 19, it says, "This is the record of John when the Jews sent priests and Levites from Jerusalem to ask him, 'Who art thou?' the first question that they ask Jesus' forerunner, John, is, who art thou? And I think that this question, who art thou, in a Girardian analysis, this is a very powerful question, because the whole idea with mimetic theory, right? The whole idea is that if all desire is a desire for being, and we're imitating people based on the being that we perceive them to have, this sort of abundance of being flowing out from the, superstar basketball player, superstar pop idol. If we're observing them as somebody who has an abundance of being and we want to partake of that, then the question of who are you becomes a question that we ask ourselves as imitative beings. And so in the Girardian analysis, I think that question has a double meaning, because humans are naturally imitative. And I think that's a feature that's built into us by God to allow us to imitate him, ultimately. That's the real reason for that aspect of human nature. But in a fallen state, this, I think, more frequently results in the imitation of imperfect people.
Well, okay, so to again go back to the metaphysical thing, the book to read here is On the Incarnation by Athanasius, who sets forth the what we're really discussing about how the logos that was the original blueprint for our nature had to come back and get stamped onto it again, because that's the original blueprint, and everything else faded away. So us being imitative creatures means we need some kind of a blueprint or some kind of form kind of stamped onto our being. When it comes to imitating others, it's not necessarily always bad. And the difference is, I think, again, I saw this in St. Maximus the Confessor, or some kind of idea floating around there, that the fall or false imitation happens when we don't see anything beyond that other person, right? So the idea is like every person is an image of God. I mean, that's your basic Christianity. That's like in the American Constitution, right? We're all created by God. So everybody's got the image of God stamped into them, so to speak. So we should behold and perhaps even imitate our neighbors as images of God, right? So it's sort of like, I guess in an Orthodox terminology, a person is an image of God, an icon of God, right? So we should behold them and imitate them and admire them, because in them we perceive that divine stamp. False imitation happens when we don't see beyond the person. Like we don't see the divine stamp in the person, and we mistake the person, or we mistake that earthly transcendence for all there is. That's when we get lost, and that's when, because earthly transcendence, earthly goods, right, money, wealth, whatever, it's limited. It's a scarce resource. So the moment you start idolizing that is the moment you necessarily come into conflict. And in fact, desiring it increases scarcity, right? If nobody wants something, it doesn't matter if it's scarce, right? But if everybody wants something, even if it was abundant at the beginning, everybody desiring it infinitely becomes scarce. So I think that's just a careful thing to distinguish there, right? One might think like, oh, we can't look at anything, just look at Jesus or something. Like, we are allowed to admire other people as long as we admire them as, again, icons of the divine in them.
Right. No, I actually do think that's a super important distinction, because the idea is, and I think it's spoken of in 1 Corinthians, Paul, he actually says, imitate me as I imitate Christ. The idea, I think you put it forth pretty well there. The idea is that there's a hierarchy, right? And as long as we understand our relation to that hierarchy, then things can sort of go smoothly. But it's whenever we sort of, the satanic approach, you could say, is to take this position of like, I am going to exalt myself above the Most High, right? Or I'm essentially going to become this autonomous being that sort of takes the place of God in my own framework. Or maybe
you deny the divine stamp in you. You think that the stamp or the logos that you carry originates within yourself. And then you try to, I guess one way to say it, you try to make the universe rotate around you as though you are the origin of yourself. So again, I think it's interesting how the Girard terminology matches your Christian basic idea, right? The self, worship of the self, worship of the other, and so on.
Right. And I
Yeah.
think what's interesting to me, and I encourage, if you're watching this and you're maybe skeptical of Christianity or something like that, I think Girard is honestly like a great entry point for a lot of people, because what Girard puts forth is it's a psychological perspective, it's an anthropological perspective, and in my view, it doesn't take many metaphysical assumptions to kind of see what Girard is putting forth is just plainly how people are. You spoke a lot about just now. You spoke about what people are after becoming more scarce. One of the things we're going to continually see, I think, in this gospel with relation to mimetic theory is status. Status is huge, because status is this sort of immaterial good that a lot of people are after, and it directly relates to your reputation, your how you're perceived by other people, your social capital. And what's interesting in chapter 1 verse 19 is that they're asking the Pharisees, or the people sent by the Pharisees are asking John, "Who are you?" Because they're trying to figure out if he's the Christ, because he's sort of gathered his following around him. There's a lot of buzz sort of going around John, and John, what he does is he actually doesn't identify himself. He doesn't immediately identify himself in answering this question. Instead, he answers in a sort of apophatic fashion. He says, "I am not the Christ," because for the Pharisees, John is kind of a source of envy, because the people recognize in him what the Pharisees spend so much time trying to appear to be, which is holy, radiating with God's energy. But John, I think in a subversive sort of act, he chooses not to capitalize on his recognition from the crowd. And he puts himself in the secondary role. He says, "No, I'm just proclaiming this person who's coming, who is Christ." And then the first thing we hear from Christ in this gospel, it's in verse 37 of chapter 1. He says, "What do you seek?" That's the first thing that he asks. And so it's interesting, I think, that the question we get from the Pharisees is, "Who art thou?" Which is a question of self-identity. And then from Christ, we get the question of, "What do you seek?" Because it's directly related to desire. Our primary interaction with the Logos is one which calls into question the orientation of our heart, right? How is our heart oriented toward the Logos, toward God himself? Whenever we have been given free will, are we choosing to desire? Because also
that verse I always interpret it as, I think in the other gospel there's a similar first words of Jesus when he's a teenager, or when he gets lost in the temple, and he tells his parents, the first word he speaks is something along the lines of, "Why do you seek me? Don't you know I must be about my Father's business?"
Mm-hmm.
So those two are similar, and to me it always read something as, "Are you sure you want to seek me, or as in God, or do you just want to seek your own self-interest?" So it's something like, be careful if you're seeking me, because it's not going to be it's not going to be about your selfish desires, right? You're going to have to look elsewhere. So anyway.
Right. Well, and I think it also, that what you just said, it kind of points to this whole idea that, whenever you approach the Logos, you might be coming from some sort of a self-seeking sort of thing here, but what a person might not necessarily realize is that you're going to receive your identity in the Logos, ultimately, but it just might not be what you expect, and you sort of have to submit to whatever that is, because in the next section here, Christ is actually going to be giving his followers their names, right? They already had names. They're human beings. They were born. Their parents gave them names. But to me, I think that this sort of symbolizes, from a Girardian perspective, that the human yearning for identity is realized when coming into contact with the person of the Logos. And I think this is kind of far from the sort of Buddhist concept of no self. The self here in the Christian or in the Girardian perspective is all too real. Like, it is something that we are sort of constantly having to deal with, but it can only really find its completion or perfection or its end, its telos, in its relation to the Logos.
Right. So going back, again, my recent exposure to St. Maximus, the Confessor, and maybe Gregory of Nyssa too, but not just do you end up being something you didn't expect if you align yourself with Christ, but you become something incomparably better. That's the faith. The idea is that the fall, or turning away from the Logos, is always a diminishing of the person. I mean, otherwise maybe leaving the garden was a good idea, right? But it clearly wasn't. So the greatest good, when you turn towards and you align yourself with the divine logos in you, that is when you achieve not just the fullness of your human nature, but you kind of like open yourself up to receiving this divine light that forever makes you better and better person. And when you turn away from that, you're just obscuring, like your light is slowly going out.
Right. It's a turn away from being or participating in being or something even beyond being itself, and turning
Right.
toward, non-being. That is essentially sort of what our view of sin is. It's ceasing to partake of God. In chapter 2, verse 25, it's right at the end of chapter 2. Another thing that I kind of wrote down here was that, verse 25, it said, he needed not that any should testify of man, for he knew what was in man. So this is right after a scene where, I believe that right at that point, so it's the marriage feast. And the idea is, and it's right after he turns over the money changers' tables in the temple. So already we're getting this sort of this scene where Jesus is butting up against the sort of prevailing social order, which has turned religion into a marketplace. And what I wrote down here is essentially that the Logos does not possess the same desire to impress that we see in the Pharisees. He doesn't desire to be seen of men. He's God. He doesn't need to impress anyone. He doesn't have to, show himself off or anything like that. And also, he knows how vacuous and how fickle something like reputation is, because men are very changeable. Not only that, but we'll see over the course of this gospel, and we're constantly being faced with this fact in the Girardian analysis, that people can just flip on a dime. Like when it's time for Jesus's crucifixion to happen, the same crowd that was laying down palm branches for him turns around and is ready to crucify him the next day. And so the main thing is that, from God's perspective, this desire to impress, this desire to be seen of men, this desire for reputation, status, all of this, it's meaningless, it's fickle, it's not actually what we should be chasing after. And obviously the divine person of the Logos is totally aware of this.
Also, to add another Girardian angle to, Christ constantly refusing to become a king, refusing to get on the head of the crowd. I mean, this is also very Girardian, because one thing is some kind of humility, sure, but also mob is naturally violent, right? It's looking for violent expulsion. You have a revolution potentially brewing. So if Christ becomes the king, the leader of a revolution, he is joining in the earthly mechanism, Satan casting out Satan, right? We have when he rebukes Peter, right? Get behind me, Satan. He does that when Peter wants him to become a political leader, and when Peter is scandalized about him becoming a political leader. Because political leadership necessarily, well, especially in that milieu, right, in that time and spot, means let's whip up a mob, let's expel the Romans, let's kill a bunch of people, right? So that's not how Christ is going to operate. He's not going to, that's not his mechanism. That's Satan's mechanism, right, of casting out scapegoats. So that's also essential. Girard writes somewhere that it's impossible to imagine Jesus whipping up a crowd. He always does the opposite, right? He's always diffusing crowds. He's never whipping them up, because crowds are the scapegoating mechanism, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. And it's interesting, I think, too, that you talk about this concept of the throne, because we know just from a look at comparative religion, anthropology, the Girardian analysis of paganism, that there's a very deep connection between the throne, right, kingship, and this this thing called deification, right? Like, this is something you've talked about before, but if you could kind of just reiterate
sure,
the connection there.
I love that insight from Girard. I found it very liberating. In the modern world, in today's culture, we hate authority, right? Or not necessarily hate authority, but we're all, as egalitarians, we're all asking the questions like, it's not right to have a king. Like, what justifies king all these hierarchies? And what's liberating in this anthropology is that Girard discovers this pattern. It's a scientific discovery, right? Because he traces these cultural artifacts. It seems that in your archaic village, right, if you imagine just some very basic culture, there's no pomp or circumstance, there's no wealth. So nobody can be rich, right? Like everybody's just basically in the same boat. How does a hierarchy arise there? Actually, if you look at some of these tribes that they found who were living that lifestyle, they're fiercely egalitarian, right? Small group hunters-gatherers. But anyways, not to digress, the idea is that anthropologically, the scapegoat mechanism. So what happened was, whenever a feud arises, the crowd, the village or whatever, right, the group had to vent it on somebody. It got to the point where this thing got ritualized, right, where you would prepare somebody to blame. And that, over time, that person would kind of be set apart. You almost think of some of those kind of funny, scary stories. There's a movie with, what's his name, Sean Connery, where he goes somewhere in India, they make him a king, but at the end they want to, like, sacrifice him. So this kind of almost funny thing where, like, you get captured by some indigenous tribe and they treat you like a king and you think you're the luckiest man on earth, but they're like secretly preparing like a pot to cook you in. Anyway, but this is kind of real. That like people found this in the Amazon. Like they would capture an enemy warrior, just treat him like a king, and then just like kill him. And you can find it everywhere. So the idea is that out of this sacrificial thing, this kind of setting apart for sacrifice, arose the office of the kingship and throne. And if that sounds far-fetched, you can read about it. But if you kind of want to look at it from the other side, we're living a pampered time where really being a king kind of is being pampered. But if you just think of historical times, like maybe early medieval times, who was the king? That was the guy who was kind of like the main warrior. He was the one who was going to be at the front and die. Basically, like a leader's job was exposure to violence and dying, right? Also, a king would be blamed, right, for all the problems. So still today, we scapegoat our politicians, even in democracy, right? Guy comes into office, 4 years later, he was blamed for everything. So, Girard, with this anthropological approach, links kingship with scapegoating. And then you look at the, Christianity, the Gospels, and Christ, and he is the king of the Jews and king of Israel, and he is the ultimate scapegoat. So Christ unites this scapegoat and kingship role in just like a stunning way, in a revealing way, right? The cross reveals it all to us, and that changes our perception of history forever. Anybody who hears the story, it's been noted. Even Athanasius, in his book, he says something in a very blunt language. He says wherever the story of Christ comes in, people just stop sacrificing animals, right? And this happened in modern times too. People like, I don't know, in the New World or wherever, they didn't need to become Christian. The moment they just kind of got exposed to the story, they kind of just stopped doing their whatever ritual sacrifice, because just the image of it, of the cross, and just that basic storyline, it's almost like hearing it once just makes you change your mind. And that's what's meant by Christ defeating Satan, Girard thinks, and I think there's some... That's might not be all that means, Christ defeating Satan, but it totally makes sense in this anthropological sense if we interpret the scapegoating mechanism, right, the violent sacrifice, if we interpret that as the kingship of Satan, how Satan establishes order. Well, Christ abolishes that, and now we still have evil, but it can't operate in a formal cult, right? People might say there's a satanic cult, but those guys can't run a government. Maybe they're hiding in some basement, right? Whereas in ancient times, like the king would sacrifice a bull, and maybe before that even a person. It was just out in the open. But anyways, I'm starting to rant.
No, all of it. I mean, I think all of it kind of points to this natural. So in number one, what's interesting about the fact that anywhere that the gospel is preached, paganism, the power of paganism is destroyed. This is actually an Old Testament prophecy. I just read it this week. I forget if it's in Isaiah or Jeremiah. I forget exactly where it is. But in the Old Testament, it actually points to that as a sign that the Messiah has come, because this the nations will essentially give up their idols. But then also, too, in sort of pagan human religion, there is this tendency to divinize or deify human beings, worship them like gods, specifically kings. There's this insistence or this intuition that human kings are who is responsible for the sun coming up tomorrow and the rain coming. I mean, in the Bible and all over the anthropological literature, we have ample evidence that people frequently in pagan religion identify the king with the embodiment of some divine figure. And
Right.
in chapter 3 here, there's actually a saying. It's that Jesus is speaking to Nicodemus the Pharisee, and he says, "No man hath ascended up to heaven, but he that came down from heaven, even the Son of Man which is in heaven." And I essentially just pointed to this little part here as the fact that the chief misunderstanding among humans is idolatry, namely the deification of man. And Jesus comes to clear this up by simply setting the record straight and pointing out that these pagan mythologies of man becoming a god by his own volition or ascending into heaven is bogus and it's not true. And that's part of the kind of the breaking of this mechanism in a not so minor way.
Yeah, I got another Girard technical insight here. So when we think of idolatry, right? Maybe generally we think of some kind of idolizing our passions or political powers and so on. Girard has this technical explanation about the scapegoat specifically. He says that early on, when this ignorant tribe would lynch the scapegoat. So basically, you have a crisis. The city, things are falling apart. You kill the scapegoat, and then suddenly peace returns. So Girard says that naively, these people would first of all blame the scapegoat for causing trouble, but then when peace returns, it seems as though this person ascended in heaven and blessed the community with peace through his death. And that sounds like somewhat like the Christian story, and that's why all these comparative anthropologists try to discredit Christianity by saying this is just another Dionysus myth. But it's completely different because it exposes it. But anyways, the point, it triggered my thoughts when you talked about nobody's ascended to heaven, right? Except the Son of God. Well, in some sense, with these archaic religions, they would think that the victim would ascend into heaven, and from there, once they are dead, return peace. But I guess maybe when Jesus says nobody has done that, he's basically saying that none of these victims you sacralized, which became your gods, none of them basically are in heaven. None of them have the ability to give blessings.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, and that seems to be Girard's kind of, I would say, chief insight regarding the Old Testament scriptures, is that the Jews of the Old Testament were very peculiar in their religion because they did not deify humans. Like that this was a sort of a ubiquitous practice that the Jews, oddly enough, did not do. They were a very peculiar people from the very beginning. And you kind of pointed to this idea, and I'm really glad you pointed to this because this is actually where I was going next. You spoke about how the scapegoat is seen as the person who is both responsible for the chaos, but then also their death is responsible for the remedy and the catharsis, right, after the founding murder. And this kind of points to this concept of pharmakos, right? This concept of the poison also being the antidote or the remedy. And what we'll find with people's deification of human beings and just the sacred in general is that it is both something that is highly kind of dangerous, but it's also healing, depending on the approach, obviously, and our orientation. But what's interesting is that right after this verse where he says, "No man hath ascended into heaven," he then goes on to say, "As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so the Son of Man must be lifted up." For those of you who are not familiar with this story, there's a story in the Bible that the The Israelites were falling into idolatry. They were grumbling, all of this. God sends fiery serpents to bite them, and they go to Moses. They say, hey, how do we deal with this? And essentially, Moses gets the command from God to erect a bronze serpent on a pole and command the people to look upon it. And by looking upon it, the people will be healed. It's just interesting to me that Christ actually is comparing himself to this bronze serpent, and the bronze serpent is, it's a symbol of pharmakos, this concept of the poison also being the remedy, and so I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And then, so later on in chapter 3, we have verse 19. This is the condemnation, that light is come into the world, and men love darkness rather than light, because their deeds were evil. And so, and then it continues. For everyone that doeth evil hateth the light, neither cometh to the light, lest his deeds should be reproved. And so what I essentially put here is that the chief aspect of the founding myth that we've been speaking of, the founding murder, is that it has to sort of rely on a lie in order to function. And the lie is the victim's guilt and the perpetrator's innocence. And Girard, I think, shows us that one of the chief differentiating factors between biblical narratives and other mythological narratives is the inversion of this trope, right? The Bible does not deify men. We said that earlier, but also the Bible does not absolve murderers. The Bible does not believe that when the lie says the scapegoat had it coming, that they really had it coming. The founding myth is a founding lie. That's sort of the insight that we're getting here from the gospel and just from the Bible in general. The Logos is kind of like an omnipotent referee who's watching human history and who has come to set the record straight. And this is very threatening to somebody who thinks they have sort of found a way to get away with playing dirty. Deeds clearly seen is a big theme in this gospel, right? That all men will be judged according to their works. Nothing is done in secret. The theme of recognition by God is repeated. But this time, in these verses, there's explicit reference to the thing as being done in God. And in this case, it says, he who does the truth, which is, I think, interesting because we don't typically think of truth as something you do, right? Usually you think of the truth as something that's said or a way that something is presented. But not only that, there is a certain sense in which everything is done in God. And the difference is the truth is done in God as something consonant with his goodness, right? It's like sort of participating in his goodness. And when evil is done, it's contrary to that goodness. It's contrary to God while still being in his presence. And because obviously nothing is existing apart from him. And so when you are kind of doing that, when you're partaking of some evil action or you're trying to scapegoat or you're trying to, say, oh, this person had it coming. They were a mystical, magical being. We had to kill them. You're kind of trying to hide yourself. It's almost like Adam and Eve in the garden, right? They, upon the fall, right after they bite into the apple or the fig or whatever people think the fruit it was in reality, they try and hide. They try and hide from God. How do you hide from an omnipotent being, right? An omniscient being. But their hiding is essentially a trying to separate from. And how are you going to separate from a being that your being is contingent on, right? And so,
the way you separate, you look upon created things, right? I think this ties back into what we mentioned earlier. The scapegoating mechanism happens at the end, right? It happens at the end of what? It happens at the end of desires gone dysfunctional, right? So. One way, this is such a rich story, right? Like we can't just exhaust its meaning. But since we're in the Girard space, man turns away his gaze from the right logos and fixes it upon things of this world. He has to live with his brothers and his neighbors. They are going to imitate each other. They're going to conflict with each other, and this is the point at which lie comes in, right? Because everybody's acting like they are righteous, like they are justified in their desires. They have the rightful claim to this thing and the other person doesn't. So very quickly, this kind of escalation messes with our minds. It completely skews us away from the truth, and we start living in that lie and darkness. And then when we start blaming somebody, and when things turn murderous, that's kind of the lie becoming really, like reaching its peak, where it's like we are going to kill this evil person because they ruin everything, right? But that's a lie. They didn't, and nobody can recognize that. It's a high moral question to ask: do they not, whether they know not what they do, and to what extent they know not what they do, right? So that's a kind of fascinating question. But everybody, there's sin is real. So in a sense, we have to, I guess, concede that people do know, at least to some extent, that they are lying, and they must have that primeval conscience telling them that you are just deceiving yourself and you're laying blame on somebody else unrightfully.
Right. One thing that I actually wanted to ask, so while I was reading this in preparation, there were some verses that I would read, and immediately I'd be like, okay, I know what I want to say about this, or this resonates, and I know where to take this. There was one verse that actually resonated with me, like for the sake of this episode, but I actually didn't know what could be said about it, but for some reason it resonated with me. I'm going to throw this to you as a curveball and maybe just see if, because I think you're more studied with the Girard stuff than I am. I want to see if you can come up with something with it on the fly, and if not, we can just move on. But so there's this verse in chapter 4 where it's verse 444 where Jesus says that he's trying to do miracles, and the people there in his hometown they don't believe in him, right? And so because of that he's not able to work miracles there, and so it's this verse: a prophet has no honor in his own country. Does that mean anything from a Girardian perspective, or am I kind of reaching here?
Well, I don't know how deep, but Girard mentions it. I remember also booking it when I was reading in Girard, and he just said something quite casual about how he exposes their lie, right? So, like, if a prophet is telling the truth, these people, I mean, the way I would interpret it is, you have your society, everybody fits into the system, right? Which is based around a lie. Maybe not a horrible lie, but, there's a little bit of hypocrisy. Mm-hmm. So this prophet starts speaking the truth. He ejects himself from that system, right? Because he just exposes the truth of the system. Now, if he goes to another country, right, they might appreciate him, because people are kind of seeking advice. People are looking for help from outside, right? They are looking for that wise voice to tell them what they do. So people are more likely to listen to advice from some fascinating stranger who could also be blamed and scapegoated if they're wrong, right? But if it's just one of your boys, they always say to Jesus, like, isn't this the son of Joseph or Mary? Like, isn't he a carpenter? Where does he get this, right? He's not fitting in. He's not towing the line. So, I don't know if that's some kind of deep theological insight, but it is Girardian, right? In a sense that,
Okay. Yeah, because something about it kind of rang a bell with me, but I literally, I was kind of turning the gears, and I couldn't get anything. I wanted to kind of throw it at you. But that makes sense.
It's a good one, yeah. No prophet is welcome in his own home. That's kind of a proverb at this point, isn't it?
Right. And in chapter 5, we have Jesus. He goes up to Jerusalem, and he's doing miracles. In verse 31 here, we have. So Jesus says, "If I bear witness of myself, my witness is not true." Which obviously he's being facetious here. Of course, if the Son of God bears witness of himself, his witness is true. How could his witness not be true? He's being rhetorical here. He's making a point about human beings. He's making a point about human beings and their sort of, again, we're going back to this theme of the desire for an autonomous self-identity, an autonomous self-assertion of our being, right?
I think that's the key, though. I mean, I don't know if he's being facetious. This gets into the Trinitarian doctrine, but the idea that the Trinity, the persons of the Trinity, are in relation to each other. I think I mentioned this with you a long time ago. How the idea is that everybody, you just mentioned it. Everybody says, "Imitate me, imitate me," but Christ, even though God doesn't even say, "Imitate me," he's pointing to the fact that he doesn't live in himself, but lives in the Father or something like that.
Yeah.
So this is where we get into the Trinitarian thing, and how God is a relationship too of mutual, I don't know, countenance and so on. So
Yeah.
it's not just when we talk about this kind of Isaac Newton. I was learning about Isaac Newton, right, and the monistic God who's just one person. Got nobody to talk to or something like that, and in that case it's like imitate me, but with the Trinity it's like even God is just living in like perfect love or some kind of mystery like that, where they look up to each other, the persons of the Trinity, and they empty themselves to each other. So
Yeah. Okay. Now that you mentioned it, I think that is definitely kind of a more precise framing here. I think I was maybe being a bit too like myopic, because I'm thinking about it in terms of.
I see your point to some extent. Yeah. Like, yeah.
But what you're, I think from that perspective, that's a more precise kind of formulation of it. But so he's speaking to the Pharisees in this case, and he says, and he goes on to say, he says, "There's another that beareth witness of me." So obviously he's speaking here of the Father. He says, "I know that the witness which he witnesseth of me is true." And I just essentially wrote down here that obviously Christ could never be untrue, right? But then here in his dispute with the Pharisees, he's kind of pointing to that true source of identity that we all essentially have, which is that we're in God, right?
Right.
And he is, the source of our our identity, our becoming, our recognition, our witness. And then moving on, he kind of says, there's just a really short verse here, and I think this is just like a really good summary of a lot of what's going on in this gospel from a Girardian perspective, which is 541, where he just says, "I do not receive honor from men." Like that one's just kind of, and it echoes again to that earlier verse we were talking about a prophet not receiving honor in his own country. And then let's see here in chapter 6. We kind of move on to again to this theme of being taken by force as a king that you were kind of speaking about earlier. And so 6:15 specifically says, "When Jesus therefore perceived that they would come and take him by force to make him a king, he departed again into a mountain himself alone." And so being taken by force and made a king after a miracle, because this is right after a miracle. This is right after the fish and the loaves and feeding the 5,000. It's a very Girardian theme, obviously. The king in Girardian analysis is actually a tragic figure. He's not, as we were saying earlier, this person who's living a cush, lavish life. It's not someone you would hope to be. They were seen as magical people upon whom the entire sacred social order was resting. And as soon as the desires of the people could not be satisfied by this person, or would not be satisfied by this person, then they would cry for his replacement. And so, Jesus, obviously, he doesn't need honor from men. That's not ultimately his mission. And so, again, we see this like sort of withdrawing, this continual withdrawal, rather than continuing to engage in the crowd, because you can get like swept up in the crowd with the Girardian analysis. It's almost sort of inevitable, due to our weakness. I mean, imagine any person in Jesus' position there who would have the humility after all of that to be like, "Oh, okay, all these people want me to be king. I'm going to step back." It just doesn't happen like from a purely human person.
Sure.
And then right after this, we go to chapter 7. It says, "The Jews sought to kill him because their hatred of him it's boiling at this point." Another thing too that we can pay attention to in this gospel is how the tensions kind of steadily rise and rise and rise and rise and rise and rise and rise. And what I felt like I kind of noticed throughout this gospel is that because Christ is an actually divine person, he is able to get out of some of these situations and prolong what would normally result in an immediate stoning or an immediate, just like sacrificial thing happening. And because of that, it's sort of, I said, so I wrote down here that, Jesus is somebody from a backwater town, and he's proven himself a greater authority than the Pharisees, and this causes them a lot of envy and a lot of anger. And he's receiving more attention by virtue of his being, right? Which is an imitation of no human person, but is directly from the Father himself. And then, did you have anything?
Big thing. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know if this is Girardian, but having read it recently, I think one theme is that the Pharisees, right, the elites, they operate on this like strict law, rules-based order, right? And if anybody who threatens the rules is threatening their order, what Jesus seems to be showing them in an escalating manner is he seems to be showing them the purpose of the rules, which they forgot. The most classic example being healing on the Sabbath, right? So he heals on the Sabbath. The idea here is that the point of the Sabbath and all the other laws is to heal human nature, right? And then when the Pharisees pick the law in itself over what it's supposed to achieve, they are exposed, and they can't sort of countenance that, okay? And they kind of relapse into this idea of law and order is important to maintain the society in order. It doesn't matter if it heals or doesn't, right? It's better that a man die than the whole nation perish. That's something one of the high priests says, maybe in another gospel. So it's this prioritization over rules, prioritizing them over what they're supposed to achieve. And then Christ says, I'm the fulfillment of the law, and so on. Constantly point to the idea is that these rules, the Sabbath was made for man, and all these rules are made for the healing purposes. So I just wanted to point out that great theme in there.
Right. And kind of, in this same chapter, so obviously the Pharisees are getting ready to kill Jesus at this point. So it says the Jews' feast of tabernacles was at hand. His brethren therefore said unto him, depart hence and go into Judea, that thy disciples also may see the works that thou doest. For there is no man that doeth anything in secret, and he himself seeketh to be known openly. If thou do these things, show thyself to the world. And I thought this was kind of interesting too, because I think it's interesting that right after giving the human reason behind recognition seeking, it also says that his brothers did not believe in him. And I think that these things are connected. It's that because of they're thinking of these things in human terms. They're thinking of these things in terms of like what would motivate a human to act in this way, a mere human who is seeking recognition from other people. And sort of falling into this Girardian trap. It would make sense that because they're interpreting it in that way and interpreting his actions and his motivations in that way, that they would not understand, or that they would not believe in him.
Right.
And then 7:18, and also if at any point, I'm just going to try to just chug along. So if at any point you something comes to mind, just feel free to hop in or interrupt. He that speaketh of himself seeketh his own glory, but he that seeketh his glory that sent him.
Right there is on our point about what were we saying about imitate my Father, right?
Right.
I seek the glory of he who sent me, right? It's very Trinitarian, right? Because God himself does not seek his own glory in some sense, right? So even God himself avoids that what might be called narcissistic thing. And we are supposed to imitate that. So basically we are invited to imitate seeking not our own glory. So even our ultimate model is not seeking our own glory.
Right.
And that goes to the things, and that just makes so much sense. Because, Girard talks about gurus. He uses the word guru. The guru comes up and tells you basically what? He's like, don't be like others. Don't imitate anybody like I don't imitate anybody. So like the guru says like, if you want to be original, if you want to be different, do what I do. So there's a contradiction in this like earthly thing,
Yeah.
right? The person who's telling you to whatever lose your ego or whatever, that person is just kind of pointing everything towards themselves, and thereby boosting their ego. So there's always this contradiction in these sort of earthly pursuits, because ultimately it ends in a person and an ego, whereas Christ, being Christ, being Son of God, still says, I don't, I don't seek this for my own sake, which is amazing, right?
Right. Have you ever seen that video of the, I think it's Sadhguru, where he says, the people are retarded.
Yeah.
Seen that? Okay, so
That's a good one, yeah.
which is also very Girardian in theme.
I dropped the main thing, but Girard had a good line about the gurus. I mean, I'm not bad. That doesn't necessarily mean like the Hindu gurus in California, but any kind of modern guru. There's some kind of clever turn of phrase where it's like you kind of see the hypocrisies. Like, don't imitate. There's a contradiction. Don't imitate me, but imitate me. One of those double minds kind of thing.
Right. Definitely. That's the nature. I mean, that really is the nature of any guru, right? I mean, the whole idea is, I mean, you hear about cults of personality, right? It literally is like cults of personality are a super Girardian thing, because essentially all these people gathering around, almost like little, you hear about people being orbiters, and what do we know about like planets? Like small moons will be pulled in by the gravitational pull of this larger body and will sort of revolve around it. I see personality cults in that way, or cults of personality in that way, and I see that as a deeply sort of Girardian theme here.
It's also like it's a humor thing, humor's device where your idol, like the cool Hollywood actor or whatever, they look so chill on camera, but then at home they're like the most vindictive, like drug-addled, petty people. They're like tyrants to their servants or something. I mean, this has been a trope forever. Right. So this thing, playing it cool, but not being able to pull it off. Yeah.
And so with chapter 7, it says, I think the framing for chapter 7 is important here, because it says, after these things, Jesus walked in Galilee, for he would not walk in Jewry because the Jews sought to kill him. And so the main idea here is that in the Girardian sense, we are at the boiling point, right? Things are spilling over. The Pharisees are ready to kill Jesus at the second that they get the chance, right? He's already avoided a scapegoat attempt already. In verse 24, I thought this verse was really interesting. It says, because he's specifically saying, why do you seek to kill me? And it's specifically with regard to him healing a man on the Sabbath. And Jesus is saying, is it because of a good thing that you seek to kill me? And he tells them, judge not according to appearance, but judge with righteous judgment. And I love this verse for two reasons. One of them is just a practical reason, which is that the caricature of Christianity is that, oh, aren't you a Christian? Aren't you supposed to not judge people? I mean, but this verse, obviously I like this verse because it says, no, you should judge, but it should be with righteous judgment, right? You're not supposed to judge people, with regard to the sins that you yourself are, actively committing, but we should judge with righteous judgment. But related to the Girardian side of things, judging according to appearance, I think this is an interesting sort of thing here, because throughout this whole gospel, we've been talking about the theme of recognition, the theme of being seen, the theme of status, having the focus and the attention on you, all of this stuff, and being seen of God, getting recognition from God. But he says, judge not according to appearance. And I think that judging according to appearance is contrasted with judging with righteous judgment here, because appearance is just another word for for honor, or like a word that we use in connection to things like honor, glory, recognition, and the idea that these are all shallow things to cling to. Ultimately, they are not where we derive our being. They're not what we should ultimately be after. They're not the most valuable things that we should be desiring. And ultimately, they're not even really based in reality, if you think about it, because they're so fleeting and they're so changeable. And I have one more verse that I had written down for chapter 7, and we're right at about an hour now, and this is kind of a third of the way through the gospel. So maybe we could continue this into like a part 2 and 3, at some point. I don't know if you're up for that, George, but
All right. Well, are we gonna do one more verse now?
yeah,
Or?
yeah. I was gonna do like this one more and kind of cap it off, because also it leaves us off at a really good stopping point, I think, for the next episode. But so verse 753, it says, "And every man." So this is after this big kerfuffle we've had with the Pharisees, right, where Jesus is just refuting them. And keep in mind, they wanted to kill him before this conversation, and so now after this conversation, things are even worse, right? But it says. The Pharisees are having this discussion, and they're trying to decide what to do. Essentially, it says there is a division among the people because of him, and so the chapter 7, it ends off. It says every man went unto his own house. Okay, this is speaking of the Pharisees. This is speaking of them meeting when they're trying to decide what to do here, because they were already ready to kill him. And he got away, he slipped away. And then he comes again, and he sort of tells them off again for this whole chapter. And then now at the very end of the chapter, it says, every man went unto his own house. For me, this seems like a really inconspicuous verse. What is it? Why would we care or pay attention to the fact that everyone is going into their own house? But I think, in my reading at least, that this is showing us a few things. And number one, I think... it's been repeated multiple times that they desire to lay hands on him and kill him. And for me, their retiring to their own houses shows that things have not yet reached the point of mimetic crisis, even though it seems that way, right? Scapegoating is imminent, but going each to their own house is it's still a sort of differentiation that's happening, right? Because the idea is when people are scapegoating, when people are stoning someone, they're not in their own houses. They're out in the streets. And you could think about like everyone being in their own house versus everyone being out in the public square as this difference between everyone being differentiated still versus everyone being in this collective mob that's ready to converge on a victim. And then number 2, it says, Nicodemus, he's actually stalling for Jesus in this. And I forget why.
Right.
I forget why I wrote that. I'm sure if I go and
Is Nicodemus is the one who visits him at night?
Right. Right.
Yeah. So.
I forget if there's a specific mention of him in the chapter. Oh yeah, right here. I just had it. Okay. Oh. Yeah, it says that Nicodemus saith unto them, he that came to Jesus by night, being one of them,
Sure.
Doth our law judge any man before it hear him and know what he doeth? So Nicodemus is stalling, right? And this is why everyone goes into their own house. And so I just think that returning to their own house, it means that there's still a sense of differentiation in which we can all rest.
Yeah.
And
Fair enough.
that's,
Yeah.
when everyone's in the
So
street.
you're saying it's another way. It's another way of saying they dissolved the mimetic escalation.
Yeah, well, and this is sort of maybe what I didn't maybe point out is that I think every other time in history that something has gotten to this hot of a boiling point, they've just scapegoated the guy. Like they weren't able to get away because they were just a human being, right? But in these previous passages, it talks about Jesus like slipping away, and it's sort of implied here that it's not because they just weren't ready to kill him yet; they were totally ready to kill him. And but he's a divine person that he says repeatedly throughout the Gospels that like you're not going to be able to take me of your own accord. I lay my own life down and I take it up. And so the idea is that for once in history, where normally there would have already been a founding murder, a scapegoat, like 2-3 chapters ago, Jesus, because he's a divine person, he's able to sort of let things dissipate. People are kind of forced to deal with this like frustration in the moment because they don't have that catharsis yet.
On another positive note, and I wrote about this when I wrote about anti-Semitism, now that we're living in a pretty anti-Semitic moment, right? I would, you credit it to Jesus' divine nature, the fact that lynching didn't happen right away. I also credit it to the Jews. Everybody's saying now, Jews killed Christ and so on and so forth, but Christ came among the Jews because that was the most, we can say that that was the most advanced religion of the time.
Yeah, absolutely.
If he showed up in Rome, that's where he would have been done in about 1 hour, or probably any other thing, any other place, because in those times, before Christ was crucified, everything operated in a very strict, violent, sacred. I mean, you go to Rome, like in the Caesar's place, and you start, disrupting the peace, or I don't know, any like imperial China, they're gonna take you off the streets like right away. So just the fact that these scribes are trying to reason with him in their own manner is really amazing. The fact that he actually managed to pull this out, it's not okay. Yes, he's divine, of course, but just I was struck when I first kind of started studying. I was struck by like the really the tolerance of the cultural environment. Obviously fallen, right? But again, I mean, just ask yourself the question. We're going to study history. Can you think of another culture at that time where this story could have played out over 1 year, where it wouldn't have escalated within a day into a stoning? I don't think so, from what I know about history. So there's that too, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I also would attribute. I mean, you got to think most of these early converts to the church were people like Nicodemus. They were Jews who were maybe sort of 1 foot in with the Pharisaical tradition, but also they could kind of recognize this new name by which the people of God were about to be called, and this new way that was available unto men. And so
the matrix was there, discussion was there. It was relatively open discussion, right? Obviously you can blaspheme and like stuff like that, so it's not like freedom of speech kind of stuff. But it's amazing how much actually discourse is going on without it just turning into like a total like rage mob right away.
Right. Yeah, and I think it's right to point that out. One thing I do want to say though, obviously, is that like it is said in the Gospels that one of the reasons that they don't stone him right away is because it wasn't legal for them anymore because of the Roman occupation. So I think another thing too is that I think for a lot of people there's a question, right, of like, why did, if we have video cameras now and miracles could be so easily proven and God really wants us to know him and to believe in him, why wouldn't he appear at a time where there's video cameras and all this kind of stuff where we could more easily verify what's going on? I totally, what you're saying about Judaism being sort of the most developed religion of the time, I co-sign that. I think that is very
Temple Judaism, right?
Right. The Second Temple Judaism. We don't want to go too far. But also at the same time, you could also point to Rome. You could say Rome is the most politically developed society at the time. And so what I think is really answer to the question of, well, why did Jesus appear at this specific time in history? Why not any other time? I honestly think it's because you sort of have the height of religiosity with the height of political power overlapping, right? And still the Son of God sort of, I think, appears at this point in time to show that, even both of these forms on purely human terms are still insufficient, and they still are not enough to deliver man from his predicament. But I think this was a great episode. I think we should do a part 2 and cover the rest of this gospel. But guys, definitely go check out George Boreas' Substack. And thank you guys for watching. Subscribe to the channel. George, thank you for coming on.
My pleasure.